Now, of course, we were all absolutely shocked by the terrible tragedy in New Zealand in the past week. The massacre of innocent people going about their daily business, in this case attending a mosque, or two mosques as it turned out. And I note that the New Zealand Prime Minister has said that she will not mention the perpetrator's name, who happened to be Australian, and so neither shall I. And this has prompted the Australian Skeptics to publish the following statement, published at www.skeptics.com.au on the 19th of March 2019. Australian Skeptics Inc. on Christchurch tragedy. Australian Skeptics Inc. is deeply saddened by the horrific terrorism attack in Christchurch on Friday, which targeted the Muslim community. Our deepest condolences go out to all those affected, those who are grieving the terrible loss of family, friends, colleagues, neighbours, through an act of violent hatred. We stand with you at this awful time and offer our support. As an organisation, we are committed to diversity and inclusivity, and to challenge those who would spread fear and hatred. And it's, I guess it's a little bit ironic that I learnt about this horrible tragedy not long after I'd finished speaking to the Bay Area skeptics, and part of the talk I was giving concerned New Zealand and the so-called psychic detectives in New Zealand, and I made the point that there's not too many murders in New Zealand, so anyone can research, especially unsolved murders. There's just not that many. How sad it was then to hear about this horrible tragedy, and to realise that many people were murdered at the same time. And even though the Skeptic Zone podcast is independent from the Australian Skeptics, I am in both organisations, of course, and the Skeptic Zone completely echoes the statement by Australian Skeptics Inc.
Welcome to the Skeptic Zone, the podcast from Australia for science and reason.
Yes, it's the Skeptic Zone episode number 544 for the 24th of March 2019. Richard Saunders here with you from the San Francisco Bay Area, where I'm visiting for a couple of weeks. And yes, what a terrible story coming out of my part of the world. New Zealand, just across the ditch, as they say, from Australia. And as I record this introduction, it's now just over a week since that terrible tragedy. Now, coming up on this week's episode of the Skeptic Zone, we're going to start with an interesting story about movements lately by online outlets like Facebook and so on to curb and curtail and inhibit, limit activities of the anti-vaccination crowd. Now, I think this must be in response to recent outbreaks of things like measles, especially in the United States. And we'll hear from various news outlets about what these online organizations are doing to limit the impact of anti-vaxxers. Following that, it's the Raw Skeptic, Heidi Robertson from the Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters. Heidi is going to be telling us about some news concerning Pete Evans, Paleo Pete Evans, a past winner of the Australian Skeptics Bent Spoon Award for the most preposterous piece of paranormal or pseudoscientific piffle. Now, it seems Pete Evans has been sharing links to his many followers, in the millions, about anti-vaccination and the dangers of the new 5G network. Who knows, maybe Pete Evans will be in line for yet another Bent Spoon Award. Find out more coming up with Heidi Robertson. Then to round off the show, we continue our series of interviews, reports, items, articles from the Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian Skeptics. This week, Tim Mendham looks at a magazine and an online site. The magazine, a new age wonder of puff and sugary nothingness, and online, the Flat Earth Movement. Stay tuned at the end of the show for more information from me, but for now it's time for me to run upstairs and indulge myself with something that I can get pretty easily here in California. Jalapeno potato chips. Oh boy. Oh boy. While I enjoy those, I hope you enjoy the Skeptic Zone. We live in interesting times now when it comes to the question of anti-vaccination, vaccination, this sort of thing. For years, as you know, being a loyal Skeptic Zone listener, dating right back to the very early episodes with Dr. Rachie Reports, and more recently with the Raw Skeptic Report with Heidi Robertson from the Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters, we have been consistently and strongly in favor of vaccination and consistently and vehemently against the rabble, the ragtag rabble of ratbags and misfits who call themselves the anti-vaxxers. Well, let me take that back. They don't often call themselves anti-vaxxers outright. They will use euphemisms like freedom of choice or pro-choice or pro-health or things of this nature. And this segment is prompted by the fact that I was driving down the California freeway just a couple of days ago, and a news report came on about Facebook cracking down on anti-vaccination sites and postings, together with a interview with one of the people involved in a recent anti-vaccination movie. Again, they'd probably say it was not anti-vaccination, but there you go. And they were complaining about Facebook interfering with their freedom of speech. And free speech, the idea of free speech does come up a lot when we're talking about things like people advocating anti-vaccination. They've got every right to say what they have to say, they say, especially under the American Constitution, to say these things. I mean, we don't have freedom of speech in Australia to say any damn thing we want. There's libel laws for a beginning. You can't, as they say, you can't yell fire in a crowded theatre, unless there's a fire, I guess. And even here in the United States, you can't simply say anything you like and then back that up by saying, but it's free speech. But to get back to the original idea behind this particular segment, we have news of Instagram, Facebook, GoFundMe, all cracking down on anti-vaccination. And I will read from a variety of online news sites for this report. And we'll start over at the Hill website, thehill.com, published on the 21st of March. Instagram to block anti-vaccine hashtags amid misinformation crackdown. And I'll quote some of the report here. Instagram said Thursday it plans to block a slew of anti-vaccine hashtags amid an ongoing crackdown on medical misinformation on the platform. The company, which is owned by Facebook, shared its plans after media outlets inquired about anti-vaccine misinformation continuing to be spread on the social media giant's platforms. The story goes on. The spokesman said the platform's planned, quote, short-term measures, end quote, will include blocking hashtags associated with, quote, known health-related misinformation, including hashtag vaccines cause autism, vaccines are poison, and vaccines cause SIDS, end quote. And it goes on to say the recent measles outbreak in the US are in part due to the increasing number of people not getting vaccinations, and experts warn the movement largely uses social media to promote their views. This is very true. And this is, of course, a very important part of this story. We are seeing around the world fresh outbreaks of things like measles and chickenpox, things that should have been now consigned to the annals of history. And we pick up the story now from Wired.com. Facebook will crack down on anti-vaccine content. The story says, as Clark County, Washington combats an ongoing measles outbreak, Facebook announced Thursday that it's diminishing the reach of anti-vaccine information on its platform. It will no longer allow it to be promoted through ads or recommendations, and will make it less prominent in search results. The social media network will not take down anti-vaccine posts entirely, however. The company also said it was exploring ways to give users more context about vaccines from expert organizations, end quote. The decision was widely anticipated. Facebook, along with YouTube and Amazon, has faced criticism from journalists and lawmakers in recent weeks for allowing vaccine information to flourish on their sites. The story goes on, Facebook will also reduce the ranking of pages and groups that spread misinformation about vaccines in search results and in its news feed. In February, The Guardian found that anti-vaccination propaganda often ranked higher and outperformed accurate information from more reliable sources on Facebook. Now let's flip over to USA Today for our next segment in this report. GoFundMe is cracking down on anti-vaccination campaigns. GoFundMe is one of the latest online platforms to cut off proponents of anti-vaccine related content. The online fundraising service said on Friday that any campaigns created on the website that promote, quote, misinformation, end quote, about vaccines automatically get shut down for violating its terms of service. Quote, campaigns raising money to promote misinformation about vaccines violate GoFundMe's terms of service and will be removed from the platform, end quote, GoFundMe said in an email to USA Today. The story goes on to say the crackdown on anti-vaccination content comes after other online platforms like Facebook and Instagram have begun to remove channels and posts from their websites that try to discredit vaccinations. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, there have been 268 cases of measles reported in the US so far in 2019, compared with a preliminary count of 372 for the year 2018 through December 29. In 2010, 63 cases were reported. And that last set of numbers speaks sadly about the fact that more and more parents are buying into this anti-vaccination guff, and it is having an impact with the increase of these diseases. Now, this general story has caught the attention of media back in Australia, and I'll play a short clip now from a segment on the Sunrise program on the 7 network, part of the segment involving this very question.
Prominent anti-vaxxers are being banned from spreading their dangerous messages on Facebook and Instagram. The Daily Telegraph reports NRL wags Taylor Winterstein and Chanel Cartwright have had restrictions placed on their accounts now. Last month, the social media giant introduced measures to prevent misinformed messages about vaccination being spread on their sites. Joining me now, Christy Mercer from the Thinker Girls, Melissa Hoyer from news.com.au, and the morning show's Kylie Gillies.
Hello.
Is this a good move, or is this preventing free speech, Christy?
People go a bit bonkers for free speech, but I think we live in a very different age that we used to, whereby people these days are not just individuals. We have like captive audiences thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people listening to what an individual is saying through the power of social media. So I think in a way, individuals sometimes need to be viewed as news services. And can you as a news service get on board and say, well, I don't believe that you should, vaccinate your kids for A, B, C, D, E reasons? No, you need to be held accountable. So I think in a way, of course it's important to be able to have freedom of speech and speak your mind and have an opinion, but I do think there is a line that I think it's a bit of a grey area at the moment where, where laws and opinions and ideas of the way we kind of live our lives and the way society views individuals and, is changing, because we're not just individuals talking at a pub and you can believe whatever you want because that's free speech. Particular people have millions of followers that would, say and agree with any single thing that they said which could endanger their kids or their families, which I think is important to look at.
Well, we are blocking people from coming into the country now. I mean, the free speech, issue.
So there we are, some no-nonsense common sense, in my view, from the Sunrise program on the 7 network in Australia. And finally, something that caught my attention just a few days ago I was unaware of, and we now flip over to CNN for this report. I saw a headline on the TV news as I was at the gym, working out on the treadmill, looked up, glanced up to a monitor, and I saw a headline, Kentucky governor said he exposed his children to chickenpox rather than getting vaccine. Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin says he made sure all his 9 children were exposed to chickenpox and caught the disease instead of giving them a vaccine. Quote, "They had it as children, they were miserable for a few days, and they all turned out fine." End quote. Bevin said in an interview with WKCT, a Bowling Green radio station. The governor says he supports parents who choose to get their children vaccinated and also those who decline to do so. But he said the decision shouldn't be up to government. Quote, "This is America," end quote, he said. Quote, "The federal government should not be forcing this upon people. They just shouldn't," end quote. The story goes on to say chickenpox is a very contagious disease that causes blister-like rash, itching, tiredness and fever, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It can be spread by touching or breathing in virus particles. And the story goes on. I will link to all these stories in the show notes, but let me say something about chickenpox, which the good governor might have overlooked when deciding to infect his children, that later in life those children can look forward to shingles. And having had shingles myself a few years back, I cannot say that I recommend it. I was lucky. It was mild. I caught it in time and was able to take preventative medication. It was still horrible. I felt awful. And I was very lucky because my particular shingles infected my face and the corner of my eye. But people do go blind. So there's a wrap-up of the mood of many online agencies at the moment when it comes to vaccines and vaccination, or should I say, to the rhetoric and misinformation by the anti-vaxxers. I hope it does some good. However, this is a long road because the anti-vaxxers are somewhat organized and obviously are making an impact. Skepticon 2019, December the 6th to the 8th in Melbourne. The Victorian Skeptics has released details for Skepticon 2019, the Australian Skeptics National Convention. After 2 successful Skepticons in Sydney, this annual event is returning to Melbourne. Skepticon 2019 will be held close to the Melbourne CBD between the 6th and 8th of December 2019. There will be many international speakers and outstanding locals attending, but this will be, at heart, a community event, facilitating the exchange of ideas amongst those who value an empirical mindset. The schedule is Thursday, December 5, Trivia Night; Friday, December 6, Welcome Event in the evening; Saturday, December 7 and Sunday, December 8, Main Convention, with the convention dinner on the evening of the 7th. More details of speakers and the venues will be announced soon. For more information, visit www.skepticon.org.au. That's skepticon.org.au.
It's the Raw Skeptic Report with Heidi Robertson.
Hello everyone, this is Heidi Robertson from the Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters. Last week in episode 543, Richard reported on the latest media coverage of Australian celebrity chef and former Bent Spoon Award winner Pete Evans. Pete Evans, or Paleo Pete as we know him, is a self-described anti-fluoride, anti-sunscreen, anti-dairy chef. He has no medical qualifications, and last week, as Richard covered, saw him link to a podcast promoting an anti-vaccination agenda. Pete has not rested on his laurels after that bit of media coverage. This week, he has asked his Facebook followers to read an article he linked to titled "The Dangers of 5G to Children's Health." The article is on a website run by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is somewhat of a hero in the anti-vaccination movement. You may recall, early on in Donald Trump's presidency, Kennedy claimed that he had met with Trump and that Trump had asked him to lead a vaccine safety commission. This news was widely celebrated in the anti-vaccination groups worldwide, but came to nothing. So, just to give you a brief overview of what Kennedy's website is about, the website Paleo Pete shared with his 1.5 million followers, and the link to that website that has now been shared close to 1,200 times from Pete's Facebook page. One section of the website is labelled Exposing Causes, Known Culprits, and a sample of topics listed underneath are paracetamol, flame retardants, fluoride, food additives, glyphosate, ultrasound, and of course, vaccines. Also in there is the topic of electromagnetic fields and wireless technologies, and we'll get to that in one moment. The website also has an online bookstore selling predominantly anti-vaccination publications. Now, if you're thinking, let's just ignore Paleo Pete, I'm not sure that that is the best answer. Many people are following him and sharing his posts, and he's using his platform to share his personal beliefs, some of which unfortunately do not survive the litmus test for accuracy or legitimacy and have the potential to cause harm. All comments underneath this particular post, as with all his posts, are in support of his views, and he has left many anti-vaccination comments still visible. I'm just one of the people permanently blocked from his page. I think there are hundreds of us, after attempting to bring some polite reason to the topics discussed. So this particular 5G article he shared, what's wrong with it? Well, it appears to me, as a layperson, to be a pretty good example of an article illustrating many red flags that skeptics are aware of. I want to emphasise first that I'm in no way, shape or form an expert in the safety of wireless technologies. And as with most topics that I am not an expert in, and that's most topics, I defer to the experts in the field and the current scientific consensus to see what they have to say. Going to legitimate sources of information is the only way for someone like me to try and discern good science from bad. The thing I'm most appreciative of in being part of the skeptical community is the ability to now be able to, most of the time, spot red flags in news articles, TV shows, blogs, social media posts and so on, that indicate that what I'm reading or hearing may not be a legitimate or trustworthy source. As listeners well know, one of those red flags is the use of hyperbolic, inflammatory language when describing the given topic. You'll generally not see this type of language in a reputable publication or news source that is reporting on the science behind something. However, many anti-science groups will purposely use this language to instill fear in the reader or viewer, as they are very well aware that once a person has been frightened, it is very difficult to unfrighten them. Another tactic they use is cherry-picking of the evidence, or using weak or non-replicated studies whilst ignoring other, more well-designed studies that do not show what they want. They are big fans of anecdotes, which are also very powerful influences. Now, at the Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters, we will also sometimes use anecdotes. The difference is that our anecdotes highlight or support the overwhelming evidence that is already out there on the safety and efficacy of vaccination. Anti-science people or organisations will also take a quote or a fact and place it out of context or even edit it in order to make it fit with their preconceived narrative. They make up their minds prior to writing their articles, and they find any information they can retrofit that will support their position. Yet another tactic is stating that because scientists cannot prove zero risk, then there must be an unacceptable risk that we should all be concerned about. I couldn't for the life of me remember what this logical fallacy was called, so I turned to my skeptic friends, and thanks to many of you, but first ones who explained it were Harry and Phil from Brisbane Skeptics, for reminding me that this is also known as the Nirvana fallacy. It is also common for these websites to be selling something, and in this case, as I mentioned, there is an online store full of anti-vaccination books. I'm certainly not going to read out the article in full that Pete linked to. If you'd like to read it, it is easily found on the Googles. However, I'll give you an example of the, shall we say, flowery language used in the article. Quote, unprecedented forms of mandatory irradiation, 5G frenzy, catastrophic health effects, next great unknown experiment on our children, millions of small cell towers every 500 feet on every street corner, 5G technology will blast through walls and cribs, nowhere to hide, terror, existential threat, rush to blanket the planet with 5G, experiment on humanity, end quote, and so on. So what does the science have to say on the subject of 5G? Do Paleo Pete and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. have a point? Stephen Novella, clinical neurologist and well-known skeptic and host of the podcast Skeptics Guide to the Universe, wrote a very measured article on science-based medicine on the 13th of March 2019. His blog was in response to a petition signed by 250 scientists recently and sent to the World Health Organization warning about wireless technology. And I quote from Dr. Novella's blog, "We can never prove zero risk, and technology is always evolving. Therefore, it is reasonable to call for more research as we further adopt wireless technology." He goes on to say, I think the best recommendation for right now is that while there is probably little to no risk, if you want to make sure you are minimising possible risk, then use wired earbuds for electronic devices rather than putting them up to your ear. We are living in an increasingly wireless society, and the change is happening relatively quickly. We therefore do need to monitor for potential health effects and continue to do proper research. But so far, the apparent risk from non-ionising radiation from radio frequency devices appears to be little to none, which is reassuring. Premature warnings that distort the current scientific consensus are not helpful. They tend to cause unwarranted fear, which leads to counterproductive laws restricting useful technology and unfair lawsuits. Even for an organisation dedicated to assessing the risk of radio frequency technology, it is advisable not to overstate the science, lest you lose credibility and may actually hurt the cause you are fighting for." End quote. Surgical oncologist and another of the writers for the science-based medicine blog, David Gorski, explains it as follows. Quote, "We do know from science that vaccines do not cause autism, and that cell phone radiation not only does not cause the health effects attributed to it, but almost certainly cannot cause those health effects because the energy carried by radio waves is too low to do what is claimed. It's basic physics. For instance, I like to say that although a link between cell phone radiation and cancer is not homeopathy level implausible, it is incredibly implausible, because most of the mechanisms of carcinogenesis we know involve, as an inciting event, the breaking of chemical bonds in DNA to cause mutations. And even the mechanisms we're coming to understand that might require chemical bond breakage as an inciting event are incredibly unlikely to be impacted by such low energy waves." End quote. Rodney Croft, director of the Australian Centre of Electromagnetic Bioeffects Research, was interviewed by the ABC here in Australia last year about 5G, and I'll quote a fraction of that article. Quote, "Despite research showing no link between safe levels of radio frequency and cancer, telecommunications companies and other organisations do offer suggestions if you want to reduce exposure. The Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency also recommends using hands-free or texting instead of calling, quote, but none of those things are actually based on any health effects," end quote, Professor Croft said. He goes on to say, quote, "Then there are companies that make devices that claim to block harmful mobile radiation, but of course, if it's cancelling radio frequency out, then your phone can't work." The article then says, "So, does radio frequency have any effect on human tissue apart from heating it a fraction of a degree?" That question is still open, Professor Wood said. And side note, Professor Wood is a biophysicist at Swinburne University of Technology. Quote, "Even though some of the evidence that radio frequency causes damage on the face of it looks quite compelling, there's still a question of consistency. Some laboratories seem to get quite dramatic effects, and then others try to replicate the work and are unable to." End quote. Other researchers suggest that health risks associated with mobile phones may be indirect, such as the sharply increased incident rate of traffic accidents caused by telephoning during driving, and possibly also by stress reactions which annoyed bystanders may experience when cellular phones are used in public places. What is certain, Professor Wood said, is that radio frequency is a lifesaver. Quote, "While I don't think radio frequency emerges with a completely clean bill of health, it emerges with a pretty good bill of health. The fact is that it saves lives. Think of search and rescue and emergency situations. The benefits far outweigh the risks." End quote. So I hope that Paleo Pete's followers do use a bit of critical thinking when reading articles such as this that he's linking to. I would have commented with the above points on his Facebook page, but alas, I've been blocked for a few years now. So that's it from me for now. Thank you for listening. This has been Heidi Robertson from the Northern Rivers Vaccination Supporters. You can find us on Facebook or Twitter at NRVax, that's VAX supporters, or swing by our Facebook page or our website, nrvs.info, and get in touch and say hi. Bye for now.
You told me that aliens really exist. You met them and swooned.
Sziasztok!
Всем привет!
Hejsan hejsan!
Have you ever wondered what skeptics are up to in countries where English is not necessarily the first language?
Or are you interested to learn about some fascinating and sometimes very bizarre Europe-related facts, events, or people from history of skepticism?
Or do you just want to know who's been really wrong lately?
You can find out all about that and more on the award-winning show, The ESP,
The European Skeptics Podcast. So, where can people find the show?
You can find it online at theesp.eu, but you can also follow us on Twitter at espodcast_EU or like us on Facebook. Oh, and you can contact the show by sending an email to info@theesp.eu. If you want to subscribe, do a quick search for the European Skeptics Podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get to your podcast.
The European Skeptics Podcast.
The real ESP experience.
One of us is deceived. You're driving me crazy. You're driving me crazy. I don't know how you can believe.
Now we continue our series of reviews, interviews, items from the Skeptic magazine, the journal from Australian Skeptics. We turn to volume 35, number 4, from December 2015. On page 14, an article by Tim Mendham, Readers Indigestible. Tim Mendham looks at those other publications where skepticism is a dirty word. Sometimes. This issue, we look at 2 more examples of the wonderful world of the paranormal. One is an extreme example of niceness with lashings of all things New Age that will give you a sugar rush of epic proportions. The other is more down to earth, literally. Read on. And Tim Mendham reviews a publication and a website. The first review is for a magazine called Soul and Spirit. And the accompanying picture, which is a cover of one of the issues of Soul and Spirit from October 2015. Your October Horoscopes by Russell Grant. Master your psychic energy, the number 1 way to connect with the universe. Learn to read tea leaves tonight. Astro Aromatherapy. Discover the soul-boosting essences for your star sign. How to stop feeling guilty. 7 stick-to-it secrets. Coach your self-confident. Other self-love shake-ups will supercharge your happiness, fix your relationships, and transform your life. And one of the trusted experts listed is Sally Morgan. For those of you who don't know, she claims to speak with dead people. Soul and Spirit, if ever a magazine was made of fairy floss. For those international listeners, fairy floss is the Australian equivalent of candy floss or cotton candy. Then Soul and Spirit at $8.95 is it. From its pink cover to its saccharine sweet messages, it is as insubstantial as spun sugar. You realize that while it might be tasty, as soon as you touch it, it disappears into its own niceness. A UK magazine, it covers a broad range of New Age topics, piled up on one another. One article alone shows you how to garner, quote, the wisdom of the cosmos, end quote, through a combination of herbalism, aromatherapy, and astrology. It's useful to know, by the way, that essential oils are, quote, extracted from nature, end quote. Then again, so are lamb chops and hemlock, but they're probably not on the soul and spirit menu. Apart from the astro-herbal aromas, the magazine contains quite a few sections devoted to questions from readers, with answers from various psychics, angel channelers, tarot readers, dream interpreters, and general spiritual gurus. The questions, all anonymous, so you don't know if they're real or not, covers such issues as, quote, please help me to hear my angels, or will my single spell ever be broken, or is my husband happy in spirit, end quote. The agony aunts, the magazine refers to some by name, give advice such as for the woman who lost her husband, quote, I see him chuckling sweetly as he tells me what a great job you are doing in carrying on. He says that you will be happy and that you should smile and laugh more. I can feel that all his favourite memories are of you two having fun, end quote. No mention of the loot buried under the floorboards then. But seriously, if the correspondence is real, this is patronising but potentially dangerous in its inanity. Its pop psychology would be enough to make any skeptic angry if you didn't realise that, quote, anger is not physical, it's part of our mind, and for the Buddhists, our mind is not physical. It exists by depending on the brain, the genes, the chemical reactions. But it is not these things, end quote. Vacuous at best. Beyond the Q&A sessions, Soul and Spirit has articles covering many different spiritual exercises and regimens that you can use to keep in touch with your spiritual side, your other being, your frustrated love life, realign your aura, shift your shape, or even keep in touch with pets, both those that are alive and those who have gone beyond to spirit. Seriously, Derek Akora, quote, reads the energy of two pets via photos and taps into the spirit of a kitty from the other side, end quote. The problem with these articles is that they present a plethora of complementary, at best, or contradictory, at worst, techniques for the sad, confused reader to follow. No one would have the time, money, or spiritual energy to follow all of them, so you would no doubt be worried that you had missed the one true technique that would give your spirits their much-needed lift. There is the occasional bright light. One story looks at an interesting description of the beauty of Snowdonia, to quickly descend into ghosts and lake monsters. So, who is this publication for? Well, based on the imaginary and editorial content, it seems its target audience is women, front and centre, pure and simple. Not even thinking about the sickly Barbie-ish pink colour scheme that can be found throughout. The illustrations and photography used are almost exclusively of women, apart from the male psychics who answer questions, themselves in a decided minority. There are no photos of men. Instead, as visual mentoring, there are many glamorous shots, mainly library photos of women in various poses and locations. The makeup pages are obviously for women, as are the, quote, freebies and offers, end quote, with more makeup and jewellery, and the astrology pages featuring illustrations of women for each star sign that are more sensual than spiritual, sort of Disney princesses for grown-ups, or pubescent boys. What a poor stereotype of women it presents, but surely does not represent. Endless, inane, sickeningly vague niceness, confirmatory rubbish, and absolutely no dispassionate view of anything to do with the New Age at all. All rubbish is welcome, and all rubbish is published. But it's been going for over 90 monthly issues, so there must be something for someone. And there is. The issue of Soul and Spirit under review included a free Guardian Angel bookmark. But like everything else in Soul and Spirit, it's lightweight and tinny. How appropriate. And next up for review is Flat Earthers, which is quite appropriate now, some years after this is published. These reviews have been published, given the rise of the Flat Earth movement. I wonder where it's moving to. Flat Earthers. In the paranormal world, there have always been some claims and claimants that have been, how shall we put it, weird. We're not talking about unsubstantiated here, like homeopathy, or dubious, such as Nessie. No, we're talking about those organizations that are so far out there that they are fun. And you wonder if those who run the organizations are equally having fun. Are they joking or are they serious? So it is with the Flat Earthers. First of all, we have to say that they exist and they walk among us. We know, we have proof. They have websites. Prime among them, of course, is the Flat Earth Society, www.theflatearthsociety.org. This group has its mission, quote, to promote and initiate discussion of flat earth theory as well as archive flat earth literature. Our forums act as a venue to encourage free thinking and debate, end quote. The site readily points out in its FAQs that, quote, this site is not a joke. We are actively promoting the flat earth movement worldwide. There are, admittedly, several non-serious flat earth posters, but they are fairly easy to identify. End quote. And as an aside, I would remind listeners, if they can, to view the documentary Beyond the Curve, currently on Netflix. We go back to the article. As nicely elaborated in the history section of the site, quote, the Flat Earth Society dates back to the early 1800s when it was founded by Samuel Beerley Rowbotham, an English inventor. Rowbotham's flat earth views were based largely on literal interpretation of Bible passages. His system, called Setetic Astronomy, held that the Earth is a flat disk centered at the North Pole and bounded along its southern edge by a wall of ice, with the sun, moon, planets, and stars only a few hundred miles above the surface of the Earth. After Rowbotham's death in 1884, followers of his Setetic Astronomy founded the Universal Setetic Society, end quote. The flat earth theory developed further in the US, but gradually faded in popular interest. Salvation was on the way via Samuel Shenton, a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and the Royal Geographic Society, who founded the International Flat Earth Society in 1956, also referred to as the International Flat Earth Research Society. Shenton died in 1971, and his successor, Charles Johnson, quote, actively and charismatically promoted the society, end quote. Its membership increased to over 3,000. Unfortunately, in 1995, Johnson's home was destroyed in a fire, along with all the society's libraries, archive, and membership lists. He vowed to rebuild the society but died in 2001, leaving the society's future uncertain. But do not fear. The society was resurrected in 2004 and remains active today. In 2009, it officially reopened to new members. The website is professionally designed, with a great gallery of maps, illustrations, and an extensive collection of Shenton's lecture posters, a must-read, if only for cultural reasons. copies of pamphlets and articles, as well as a wiki with lots of links to articles and videos that promote the Society's views. Sadly, the Society's last newsletter seems to have been in 1994, although it did feature the headline, quote, "Australia, not down under," end quote. Well worth a read, at least until the sun rises over the wall of ice at the edge of the earth. And that was a couple of reviews of a magazine and a website, and you can read that for yourself in the Skeptic magazine, volume 35, number 4, December 2015, freely available at www.skeptics.com.au. Thank you for listening to the Skeptic Zone, and thank you to those Skeptic Zone listeners who went along to see DJ Maynard, our reporter, Mad Maynard, doing his Maynard's Love Shack DJ session in Sydney. It was such a success, I hear there's going to be another one soon, and when I get those details, I'll let you know. Thank you to those listeners who support Maynard and myself here at the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal, and you can support the Skeptic Zone anyway at skepticzone.tv. Just click the Patreon link. Coming up in the next few shows, I hope to bring you some interviews from the National Centre for Science Education, which is not far from where I am right now, over in Oakland. I also hope to score an interview with Dr. Eugenie Scott. Always a pleasure to spend time with Dr. Eugenie Scott. And before I go, just another note about recording the podcast on the go, as it were. I'm not in the studio. I haven't got the range of microphones I normally use, so I'm sort of, but roughing it, that's not the right term. That's why when you listen to the Skeptic Zone at the moment, you can probably detect a slight variation in recording quality. Some segments sound a bit different to others. But believe it or not, even though I'm recording from a basement at the moment, there are still planes flying overhead. I think they follow me all the way from the Skeptic Zone studios in Sydney. And that is a little bit under the flight path. Well, I'm not under the flight path here, but still, somehow. Maybe it's paranormal. I think I'll ponder that until next week. But for this week, this is Richard Saunders signing off from the San Francisco Bay Area. You've been listening to the Skeptic Zone podcast. Please visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for show notes, contacts, and to access the back catalogue of episodes going back to 2008. You can follow the Skeptic Zone podcast on Twitter at Skeptic Zone, visit our Facebook page, or leave a review on iTunes. You can also support the Skeptic Zone via Patreon or PayPal. The Skeptic Zone podcast is an independent production. The views and opinions expressed on the Skeptic Zone are not necessarily those of Australian Skeptics or any other skeptical organisation.
So does radio frequency have any effect on human tissue, apart from heat?
So you would no doubt be worried that you had missed the one true technique that would give your spirits their much-needed lift.